All right, everybody, welcome back. Welcome to the second panel of the day. I'm Rachel Lifter, Assistant Professor in Fashion Studies, and I'm going to be moderating this panel. Okay, so from textiles used by Nuu-chah-nulth First Nations families to announce natural resource and territorial rights, to the pioneer of accessible architecture's innovations and processes of self-questioning, to the architects and state housing professionals who shaped post-war housing in France, as well as the women who reshaped post-war housing in France, to the gaps and holes in produced by design in the border wall along the US-Mexico border, and finally to the design in and of autonomous communities. The papers in the next panel will show us that rules, once set, are almost always questioned, negotiated, and rewritten anew, only to start the process all over again. So we'll be going in the order you see on screen here, with Denise Green first, Elizabeth Guffey, Nicole Rudolph, Victoria Haddam, and then Julie Tregoneau. Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you to all of our conference organizers today, and thanks to all of you for being here. It's a great pleasure for me to talk about some research that I've been working on since 2009. And in this work, I'm looking at the relationship between textiles that people wear on the body, textiles that are worn on ancestral bodies, and how they make declarations about territory and place and convey rights to Aboriginal title in Western Canada. So I'm going to start off by just some basic concepts in thinking about how the body is dressed. And what you're looking at here in this image is a photograph that was given to me when I was doing my field work. My background, I guess I should say, is I'm an assistant professor in our fashion design program at Cornell University, but I also teach in American Indian and Indigenous Studies, and my PhD is in anthropology. So in 2009, I went out to the west coast of Vancouver Island, and I spent on and off about 5 years living and working with Nuu-chah-nulth peoples. And I was fascinated by these large ceremonial curtains. And I came into this project working on an exhibition of these, what they're called is tlitsapithlam, for the Vancouver Cultural Olympiad, as you'll remember 8 years ago, in 2010. And so that's where I was introduced to these large textiles, and of course they're the backdrop to potlatch ceremonies, which are important ceremonies that take place at different transitional life events. So to mark a birth, a death, a coming of age, a wedding, a naming, a seating of a chief, etc. And so in front of these large tlitsapithlam, people wear ceremonial shawls. And so I'm looking at how dressing the body is a very powerful material. It's an aesthetic, it's an embodied action. And in this process, and this is true in this circumstance, but I think we can look at it more widely as well, that dressing the body also transforms our identities. It produces identities, experiences, and helps with these inter and intracultural interactions. In the case of Nuu-chah-nulth ceremonial textiles and regalia, they function to connect spiritual and terrestrial worlds and also connect politics with poetics. And they have declarative power, which is what I'll talk about today. They declare what's called hahulthi, which are chiefly territories, histories, rights, as well as rights, and other what are called family tupati. These are privileges that convey status. So the tlitsapithlam that you see here at the backdrop, what's interesting about them, they delineate space, they transform spaces. They can transform a gymnasium into a sacred site where important business can take place. And they delineate the space by creating a front and a back stage, not unlike what Irving Goffman has written about extensively. So here we see behind the tlitsapithlam. And what you'll notice here is that there's a shawl that also depicts territory. Just as the tlitsapithlam you saw from the front depicts different natural resources that come from those territories. Now, the owner of these tlitsapithlam, they're the ones that have the right to speak about them. And I've been given permission to convey some of these ideas to all of you today, but I want to make it clear it's not my right to speak about them. They're owned and very proprietary. And so Naskoasaks is the woman who owns this tlitsapithlam. And what she told me when I interviewed her about it is that the curtain helps to say, look who I am, look what I can have, look what belongs to me, and where I'm from, very importantly. I'm from a beautiful place where the water is rough and it's full of fish, and that's a big deal. Not everyone is from there. We know we're from there, and we belong there. So these are declarations. So these large flitsapitlum, just like what I'll talk about later in terms of the shawls, they're both making declarative statements about rights and territory. So where are we? I typically try to resist showing maps because maps have been used by colonial powers and authorities to dispossess people of land. But for the sake of understanding where I'm talking about, this is Vancouver Island. And then this is a map that was actually produced by one of the Nuu-chah-nulth people I worked with. His name is Nuu-chah-nulth. And this shows all of the different Nuu-chah-nulth nations and where their traditional territories are situated on the west coast of Vancouver Island. I mostly worked up in the Port Alberni region and Hupachaset and Sochat territory, so a lot of the stories I'll convey today come from those places. But more importantly, the map that's in some sense the real map, the real abstraction of space, are the flitsapitlum. This is one that's owned by Maquina. He's the Taiyi Hatwith, the head chief of the Ahousaht First Nation. And you can actually see in this abstraction of space, on this large flitsapitlum, you'll see two rivers at either end that have been abstracted. And so this flitsapitlum actually functions as a map, not only to show space and abstract space just like our maps do, but to convey and declare rights to different natural resources that come from those places, and to convey the histories of the family, their kinship, relationships, what rights they have to names, all the way through to dances and different kinds of images. They also convey maps of spirituality. So this is one section of that flitsapitlum which represents for Hatwia, or chiefs, that look after different physical realms, the sea, land, sky, and then the world beyond the horizon. Flitsapitlum can also be very representational, less abstract. This is an example of one that depicts a mountain range called Awachis, which a number of supernatural events occurred in that place. And then this flitsapitlum was actually stolen from the family, and a new one was remade in 2010 for the Vancouver Cultural Olympiad. What's important to note about the west coast of Vancouver Island is that it's a place that's very rich in natural resources. Today, fishing for salmon, particularly sockeye salmon, is very important for people's livelihoods. But historically as well, whaling, as you can see here in this image from the National Anthropological Archives, was photographed by Francis Densmore in the 1920s. And then this is one I photographed during a fish day in 2012. But what's important to remember is that anywhere there's an abundance of natural resources, there's also the exploitation of those resources. And this happened with the ongoing colonial project. So this is a film still from a film I was working on a few years back with weavers who used the inner bark of cedar trees. And we spent hours and hours driving on logging roads to try to actually find a stand of cedars where people could gather the natural resources they needed to produce the weaving. So you can see that it's constantly being logged in the Alberni Valley. This is now third generation logging. So they plant tree forests, usually trees that aren't indigenous to that region, but those that sell for more, like Douglas fir. And so this becomes a huge problem. So I'm going to take a step back now and give you just a brief history of of the place. So as you can see, very rich in natural resources, and became an important site for trade in 1778 when Captain Cook's third voyage stopped by and they realized the sea otter pelt was there. And so they became highly sought after. There was this period of intense trade between 1778 and 1824 until the Vancouver Island sea otter was hunted to extinction. Then later in the 1860s, we have the first sawmill in British Columbia is established in Port Alberni where I work. There's very few settlers at the time, so in fact indigenous peoples are fueling this very burgeoning industrial economy. And their labor, I'll talk a little bit about that later. And then in the later part of the 19th century, there's the pelagic sealing epoch, which ends in 1910, but this is a period of intense wealth in this region because Nuu-chah-nulth men were recruited up to the Bering Sea and were very good at hunting fur seals. So if you look at census records, about half of the Nuu-chah-nulth men who were over the age of 18 were actually going up to the Bering Strait and hunting seals. So how does all of, and I have this image up here, you can just kind of see it in the upper right. There's actually a Nuu-chah-nulth shawl, a robe, that depicts a whaling, and there's a man actually wearing a top hat, which would have been made out of the same seal fur that they were hunting at the time. And the cedar bark cape below shows, which I'll show a closer image of later, the different kinds of trade blankets that were then incorporated into their design. So the history of the Flitzapitlam, which I showed you earlier, goes way back, and actually the precursor to Flitzapitlam are in fact petroglyph walls that you can see the images, and they've been chalked out here in this early 20th century photograph. That they are about the same size. You can see the people there for reference. The images on these petroglyph walls are about the same size dimension as the images that you see on the Flitzapitlam. And these petroglyph walls are found in various sacred sites across the landscape, where in this case, this is where salmon spawn. Later, they translate into what are called kitsak-suathlam. These are cedar board screens that typically went in the back of large ma'as, or big houses. This is one here. You can see there's a potlatch actually happening in front of it. People are preparing soups. And then this is the screen itself, which is now held by the Canadian Museum of History. So these large kitsak-suathlam, and I'll show you a few other ones. This is another one that's at the then Museum of Civilization, now the Canadian Museum of History. So what happens, importantly, in terms of thinking about rules and rule changing, a lot of things begin to happen in the late 19th century before we have massive settlement to the west. Importantly, the Canadian Indian Act and an 1884 amendment to the Canadian Indian Act, which prohibited religious ceremonies and dances such as potlatching. This has become known as the potlatch ban. So people were prevented from doing the ceremonies that marked their important life transitions, and if they were caught doing these ceremonies, could be jailed, and many items of ceremonial significance were confiscated and taken out of these communities. So look at that cedar board back there. You might have seen it in the American Museum of Natural History. This is the descendant of the man who owned this kitsak-suathlam. We traveled to the AMNH to actually look at it. And so in some cases, these were sold because owning them would have been evidence of wrongdoing. And in other cases, they were taken. So we see these in museums all over. So how do people adjust their design to deal with these changing rules and to break the rules, continue to break the rules, manipulate the rules? And so Flitzapitlam, in fact, are a form of material resistance. So we see in the late 19th century, when you have the potlatch ban, people don't just stop potlatching. They just do it in different ways. And so this is where the Flitzapitlam becomes very important. It's something that could be very easily folded up and quickly hidden away if an Indian agent or a government official came, still depicting different rights and territories and natural resources. This is another one that's in the Menil collection in Houston. Again, you can see there's wolves, there's thunderbird, there's large whales, and even a little baby whale in the mouth. We start to see, because Flitzapitlam, right, are more mobile. They can go to different places, as opposed to the kitsak-suathlam, which were pretty much within a house. They couldn't move as easily. So because Flitzapitlam moved, we start to see more representation of landscape actually appear on the curtain. So you could actually take territory with you and display your rights to it in different places when you hold a potlatch in some other location that might not be your territory. This is another example, a little bit more abstract. And we also see, as in this case, this is painted by a man named Tomish, this Flitzapitlam very clearly, again, represents specific places on the territory. Also during this time, it's important to note that this is the period of the Indian residential school system in Canada. And so in the region where I work, residential schools were in operation until 1983, and in Port Alberni until the 1970s. And it's important to understand this in the context of how knowledge is transferred across generations, that children were taken from their homes and they were not allowed to actually practice their culture or speak their language. Other rules that come into play by the Canadian government at the time is another amendment to the Indian Act in 1914, which actually banned people from being able to appear in their traditional costume or regalia, unless, of course, they were meeting dignitaries from other countries and Canada wanted to put them on display as Indigenous people. So these are all of the rules that are happening. So if we go back to 1778, we might look at a shawl collected by Captain Cook. You can see made out entirely of the inner bark of cedar tree, and we start to see how the shawls begin to shift and change as people come into contact with traders and new materials, like this one from the Berlin Ethnological Museum, which is made up of strips of blankets. This one entirely strips of blankets, and then this one is a Hudson Bay blanket that's been completely unraveled and then woven back together again using the same wrap twining technique. So it's not technically weaving, it's wrap twining to create in the aesthetic. And then as flitsepetlum become more popular in the late 19th century, again, to do with the potlatch ban, we start to see the translation of painted shawls to be worn. Like this one you see here also in the American Museum of Natural History. These are photographs, again, by Frances Densmore. And then we see in the 20th century, the way in which artists start to use new technologies or technologies like silkscreen printing, right? We might not think of it as a technology per se, but these are used to create mass-produced designs. And I love this image. This is in 1978, wearing a Captain Who t-shirt, which references, of course, Captain Cook. This was his 200-year anniversary. So a little bit of resistance, right, happening there. So again, the shawls, with things like silkscreen printing, suddenly you can have an entire family wearing a common design, and again, declaring rights. These are shawls worn at a miat ceremony, which is a welcoming of the salmon that takes place on a particular site. And then you can find these declarations, of course, this may be more abstract, a declaration of rights to natural resources, and then some very explicit ones, like this one, where it says, Government of Canada, no, all men by these presets that the group of Indians living along the Somas River and its estuary should be able to have the right to fish. And so we see, again, as I think I'm at the end of my time, as we come back to these relationships between the flitsepetlum, the dance shawls, that they have become, in a sense, a kind of legal document, which is important today in British Columbia, where it's a place where Aboriginal title was never extinguished. And so I'm really interested to see how the courts, the governments start to use these kinds of forms of material culture, whether they have images clearly depicting rights to certain natural resources, or in this case, completely blank shawls that represent daylight that's rising up over, you can see in the background there, just barely that they're hanging a flitsepetlum that depicts different mountain ranges. And so they may depict rights to individual identities, to natural resources, but to collective identities within this community. So thank you.